Well, thank you. It's good to be back with you. A couple things before we jump in. We're going to be talking about ambition specifically tonight in the life of Moses. And eventually I'm going to be reading from Numbers chapter 20. So if you want to find your way there, it'll be a little bit before we get there. But I did want to sort of set up a little bit where we were last week and remind you of a couple things that I think are important as we continue to talk. The 5 instincts we've been looking at, we talked last week about why specifically I refer to them as instincts, that these are not necessarily sins that you need to be looking out for. Certainly that's the case with ambition, as we'll see tonight. They're not expectations. You have to have these 5 instincts to qualify as a man. But as we described them last week, they are, using C.S. Lewis's definition, behavior as if from knowledge. So these are ways we tend to live or act in life, assumptions we often make that drive our behavior, that oftentimes can be functioning as a kind of blind spot in our life, something we're not fully aware of, motivating our behavior, motivating our actions. And last week we also talked about, I haven't spent a lot of time going over it because we've been getting into the instincts, but the book is based on a little piece of advice the Apostle Paul gives to the young man Timothy. Timothy was pastoring in a really difficult place in Ephesus, and Paul told him that his advice to bear that responsibility well, to serve the congregation well, was to keep a close watch on his life and on the doctrine or the teaching. And so that's the pattern that I use throughout the book for discussing these instincts. How do you take a closer look at your own life, your inner life, begin to recognize some of those instincts that are at work within you, and then how do you check those instincts or hold them in their proper place based on what you have through Christ, through faith? So last week, we did that pattern specifically looking at the instinct of adventure in the life of Samson and the intentional practice of discernment through commitment, if you remember. That was our check on that instinct of adventure. And this week, we're going to be doing the same thing, talking about one of these instincts, trying to recognize it within our inner life, and then how Christ offers us a way not to rid ourselves of this, no more than we would rid ourselves of anything adventurous, rid ourselves of any ambition. I often joke when I do interviews that I'm not saying we need a generation of ambitionless men. We probably have too many men that don't have ambitions, but it is important that ambition is kept in its proper place and it doesn't become something else. So let me give you a way into ambition. The image that I like to use for ambition, although it's so commonly experienced, which it was interesting, it came up in our Q&A even last week, and a couple of you afterwards even mentioned, I'm really interested in ambition, if we could get to that one. So this is your week. It is, in the little assessment I have, it's the most common instinct, the highest instinct that most people report. I think I pointed out last week that may have something to do with the kind of person that takes a self-assessment as well, too. Perhaps there's some ambition. But it has always struck me how rarely we talk about ambition, for how common it is, for how much we experience it. It's not something we tend to bring up in conversation with others. It's not something we tend to want to discuss. Here's the ambition of my life. I don't think I've ever even used that phrase with another person. Or what do you think of my ambitions? For us experiencing so much of it, we don't tend to talk about it. I think ambition is like this. I think it's like a kind of poison that a wise doctor who knows how to administer well can actually use to save a person's life. Much of our medication, as you know, can also be dangerous if it's not used by a skilled person, and it can destroy. Ambition is something like that. If you have the wisdom to understand how to use that ambition, to keep it in its proper dose, to know when you need it and when it's costing you something, it can do incredible things. God can give you great ambitions, and certainly ambition have led people to great achievements and breakthroughs. But that ambition just as quickly, if in an unwise hand, and if not a person without the skills necessary to know how to administer it well, can lead to destruction, can become for that person a kind of poison. I want to use the life of Moses to take a look at ambition, hopefully show you why I think Moses is a good example of ambition at work within a life. And we're going to do that by looking at 3 key moments. There are a lot of moments in Moses' life. I'm going to be jumping pretty quickly over periods, but you can really break Moses' life up into 3 distinct sections that are around 40-year periods. The first 40 years of those, him growing up in Egypt, those next 40 years in the wilderness before the burning bush, and those final 40 years leading the people of Israel through the wilderness. And I think there's a decisive moment and experience that really centers around ambition that plays out in all 3 of those phases in Moses' life. So the first one is this. Moses has a little bit of a confusing experience with ambition because he tends to experience it in 2 different extremes. The first of those extremes is what I call a compulsion to act, to reach for action. And that's certainly what we think of when we think of ambition. What is it that ambition leads a person to do? To take action, to go out and do something, to accomplish something, to strive after something. We're compelled by ambition into action. And that plays out pretty clearly in Moses' life. All of you remember that Moses' story begins him being put in that basket, adopted into the household of Pharaoh in Egypt. And having been raised in that household, Moses would have been afforded all of the luxuries of royalty. He would have had one of the best educations that any human being could have possibly had at the time in which he was raised. He would have had access to riches and resources and talent, lessons and skills that any other person on earth would not have had access to without his position within that household. And so it is for him, the ambition that was possible is really anything that he could imagine. There was no limit to the wealth or the education, that the resources needed. If he could dreamed it, he had in his possession, for what any man could imagine having, those resources for that achievement. What's so striking, though, is Moses goes out and he sees the two Egyptian slaves the two Hebrew slaves being beaten by the Egyptian master. You remember the scene. And there's something about it that stirs him. You know the story. What does he do? He strikes down the Egyptian master that was beating the two Hebrew slaves and buries the body in the sand. Now, you could wonder about his motivations for this action. Perhaps it was a moment of rage. He was overcome by the injustice of the moment. Perhaps he mistook the identity and didn't realize what he was doing. But the book of Acts tells us pretty clearly what Moses was thinking. Acts 7:25 recounts, Moses supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. So in other words, what motivates Moses in this moment of action, this decisive moment of reaching out and taking action, was he believed that it would trigger some sort of freedom, some revolution, that he would become the leader of, as his Hebrew brothers would rally behind him. It's hard to characterize that as anything other than ambition, a moment of action driven by a vision of something profound and revolutionary. There's a really interesting story in the Midrash, not a scriptural story, certainly not on the same par as Scripture, but it gives you a hint into the way that some of the early Jews were thinking about the character of Moses and who he was during this season. And there's this commentary, this story about Moses as a child, that he used to like to play on Pharaoh's lap, that he would be brought in as an infant and placed on Pharaoh's lap. And one day while he was playing there, he reached up and he took the crown off of Pharaoh's head and placed it on himself. Now, Pharaoh, being superstitious, immediately feared that this was a kind of omen, a sign that someday this child would grow up to take power from him. So Pharaoh called together his advisors, the sort of sorcerers of Egypt, and asked for their opinion. And they decided to put the infant Moses to a test. Again, this is not scripture, but it's giving you an image of how they're thinking about Moses. So they set before the infant two bowls, one bowl that was full of jewels, diamonds, rubies, another that was full of glowing embers, so hot fire embers. And they decided that if the child reached for the jewels, they would know that he was a child of ambition and would someday reach for the crown. If he reached for the embers, then they would know he was an infant interested in shiny objects, and you shouldn't read anything into the fact he took the crown off Pharaoh's head. So they placed the child before the two bowls, and according to the Midrash, Moses immediately begins to reach for the jewels, at which point an angel comes down and redirected his hand to the embers, and he picked up one of the hot embers and touched it to his lip, and so it was that he became slow of speech, according to the later tradition. Again, certainly may not be scriptural or inspired, but what it does capture is, I think, an image of how those Jewish interpreters understood the character of Moses. They understood, just like Acts, that Moses in this early stage was driven by his reaching, by a vision and an ambition that led him to a moment of action. And certainly that's a good way to characterize the way we often think about what ambition is. You have some kind of ambition, some kind of desire or vision for what your life could be or you could achieve, and you find yourself energized by it, moved to a kind of action, a reaching for that vision, that goal in your life. Well, what plays out for Moses, you'll remember. The next day he shows up, imagining that the Hebrews will now rally behind him in this moment of revolution, and instead the two slaves, his Hebrew brothers that he just freed, said to him, "Who made you prince over us?" They began to mock him for his ambition, his vision for their life. And so it was that Moses ends that first period, that first 40 years of his life, as he flees into the wilderness. Those next 40 years go by apparently pretty uneventful. He's shepherding out in the wilderness until it is that he has that divine encounter with the burning bush. Now, you'll remember that moment well. What was it that God said to him through that burning bush, that image? We read, "Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Now, what would you expect in that moment? You would expect this is the thing that Moses has spent his entire life hoping and wishing and acting toward. This was that very vision that he had 40 years ago and seems to have failed at. Do you guys need me to do a change, or am I? Just keep going? All right, making sure. My apologies. This is the very thing that he's been waiting and wishing. He's hoped that would play out in his life. And you would imagine if you had spent 40 years working towards some vision only to see it fail, and 40 years later have an encounter with God who says to you, now's the time to go back and do it, you imagine you would say to yourself, finally, absolutely, this is it, God on my side. But you remember how Moses responds. Oh, but I'm slow of speech. How will they know you actually sent me? Can you send someone else with me for help? And finally, his appeal, can't you just get someone else to go and do it? Now, that's always been a little bit perplexing to me. How is it that Moses can be a character so decisive in action one moment, so determined to lead revolution and willing to act, and then in another moment seems so unlike that same person? He can't even bring himself to entertain the idea of going. Well, I actually think that's the lived experience of what ambition actually feels like for most of us. There's nothing like ambition that in one moment makes us feel like anything is possible, that we can achieve anything, that we can do something meaningful, and then sometimes a short time later, sometimes the same day, to feel disillusioned and discouraged at our own inability and feel like that very thing that once inspired us now becomes impossible, maybe even something that mocks us and ridicules us. The commentator John Calvin said, "Those who yield themselves up to the influence of ambition will soon lose themselves in a labyrinth of perplexity." If you were really honest about the things that you've tried to achieve in your life, the things that at one point in your life had you feeling capable and inspired and motivated, those moments where ambition was its strongest and you felt yourself most driven to action by it, I think you also understand that at other times it is just perplexing. It doesn't play out the way you expected. You fail in ways that disappoint you. You find yourself at some point disillusioned by the entire idea, and sometimes, in its worst forms, completely abandoning those things that you once believed in, finding yourself incapable of rising to even action in any form related to it. Well, how can those two experiences, action driven by ambition and this kind of disillusionment by failure, how can those both be ambition? We obviously imagine the first one, but I want to try to show you I think both of these are equally blind spots by ambition. I would define ambition as something like this. Ambition is a fixation on a vision that you have for something in the future. When your vision becomes your ambition, when you find yourself imagining that thing that you would like to accomplish, that you believe you were called to accomplish, it can become a kind of blind spot that can allow you in one moment to feel empowered by it, and at the next moment to find yourself disillusioned and frustrated by it. What unites those two experiences, as different as they may seem and feel to you, is that in both cases you are measuring everything around you, yourself included, by that vision and its fulfillment. Really, the blind spot is everything in your life gets measured against that vision, that achievement. When you find yourself making progress, you're empowered by it. When you find yourself falling backwards, you feel disillusioned by it. But the thing that unites those two experiences is you continue to measure your own worth, your own value, your own accomplishments against that vision that you hold on to, Moses held on to, even across these two periods of his life.
One of my favorite places to take a look at this is in, I told you there were some key words that were going to come up. Last week was a C.S. Lewis. Tonight you get a Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote, so every week you'll get one of those key words, I'm sure. I came across Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together, really early in ministry. And if any of you have been in ministry, you know that there's no place like ministry where ambition can become a kind of intoxicating blind spot in your life. It's certainly a good thing. It's an honorable thing to serve the Lord, to be in ministry. But how quickly it can become, like it was for Moses here, a kind of obsession by which you measure everything else in life against. And so really early, I was wrestling in ministry with what is God asking me to do? The visions I had maybe in Bible college or seminary haven't played out exactly like I had imagined. I'm still in Springfield, which is basically where I'm from. That's not what I imagined. It's hard to believe, but as a 19-year-old in Bible college, I came across Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together. If you know Bonhoeffer's story, he was a pastor in the 30s and 40s in Germany, witnessed the rise of Nazism in his time. He was actually making a name for himself as a kind of intellectual figure within the academia and had an opportunity to come to the U.S. in the 30s and do lecturing at Union Theological Seminary. And at the time, it was fairly obvious the trajectory that Germany was on in Europe. Many of his friends and people encouraged him to stay in the U.S. They recognized he was opposed to Hitler's rise to power, to the Nazi Party. They knew that if he went back to Germany, that window for later leaving was probably closing. And why throw away the gift that God has given you? Stay here in the U.S. where it's safe and continue to teach, continue to serve the seminary and the church. But Bonhoeffer felt like if he was going to have a voice to speak into the future of Germany after Hitler, then he needed to bear and suffer with his people during that time. He actually made the decision, even there in the late 30s, knowing what was ahead of him, to go back into the country and spent most of that time working in underground seminaries, underground pastors' networks. One way of putting it was I think he had a vision for how God could use him beyond Hitler, beyond the Nazi Party. He had a vision for a role he could play and a benefit he could be to the church in Germany and the people beyond it. If you know his story, that's not how it played out. He was eventually arrested, and just days before Allied troops liberated the prison camp where he was being held by Hitler's orders, he was executed, led out to a gallows, and hung. And so it was that in many ways that great ambition of Bonhoeffer's life, his reason for going back into Germany, didn't entirely play out. It wasn't fulfilled. Well, it's interesting because in Life Together, he writes a little bit about this idea of visions. And he said something that for me as a Bible college, seminary trained, church leadership expert, really shocked me the first time I read it. He writes in Life Together, God hates visionary dreaming. It makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. The man who fashions a visionary ideal of community demands that it be realized by God, by others, and by himself. He enters the community of Christians with his demands, sets up his own law, and judges the brethren and God himself accordingly. When things do not go his way, he calls the effort a failure. When his ideal picture is destroyed, he sees the community going to smash. So he becomes first the accuser of his brethren, then the accuser of God, and finally the despairing accuser of himself. I think what Bonhoeffer is writing about is ambition, a visionary dream, and that visionary dream has certain consequences that often come with it. When our lives become obsessed with a vision that we have, whether it's the picture of an ideal church, an ideal community, or just a vision of some great thing you'll achieve in a career, or perhaps in a hobby, some achievement, whatever the ambition is, it sets in front of us a kind of vision that we begin to strive after. And that vision has a tendency to turn us into a kind of judge. That when we fail, we start looking for somebody to blame. It's the people around us that are holding us back. These coworkers that keep me from achieving the vision I had for this company. This congregation that keeps me from having that ideal church that I always imagined. Before long, that judgment turns to God. God, why haven't you given me the skills? How come you haven't given me the talent or the resources? How come you haven't called me to a place like all those others? And then finally, as Bonhoeffer describes it, we become the despairing accusers of ourselves. We fall into the kind of disillusionment that we see in Moses' life, who's unable to even entertain the idea of going back and doing that thing that had once meant so much to him. So that takes us to the third phase. Those first two phases, characterized by action on Moses' part and then disillusionment, but by God's prodding and poking and convincing and miracles, he gets Moses into that moment. And what does Moses inherit for it? Does it end up becoming the ideal picture of everything he imagined liberation and freedom would be? No, he gets stuck for 40 years with a group of people constantly complaining about absolutely everything that he does. That brings us to Numbers chapter 20. I want to read, it'll be a familiar story to you. I'll begin in verse 2. Numbers chapter 20, verse 2. So this is that third phase now of Moses' life and ambition. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we have perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy." I always found that to be a hard passage to read. Moses, after 40 years, waiting for that moment of action, it finally coming and failing in Egypt, after 40 more years of shepherding in absolute obscurity, and then having that divine encounter at the burning bush, and after 40 more years of leading these complaining and nagging and backstabbing and rebellious people through the wilderness, he finally loses his cool and hits the rock instead of speaking to it, and for that, God will not allow him to enter the promised land with the people of Israel. You want to say, cut the man a break. It's been a lot, after all, hasn't it, to deal with these people? Who amongst us wouldn't have lost it at some point after everything he's been through? This is not, by the way, the first time they've complained about water. This whole thing has played out before, over and over. First, not enough water. Then not enough meat. Then the wrong kind of meat. Then not enough water again. Not to mention the times they just rebelled and talked behind his back constantly. His own family at one point started to rebel against him. But it's here, in this moment of disobedience, that Moses loses the promised land. Now think for a second that is the thing, the vision, the image by which his life has been directed and measured. It's been the thing that has energized him and defeated and discouraged him. And it comes down to this moment of disobedience in which God says, "You will not enter the promised land." So what is it that Moses does here? Is it simply a disobedience? Well, I got mad and hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Well, if you think back to Bonhoeffer's warning about ambition, I think you see more going on in Moses' action. God tells him to take the staff, gather the people, speak to the rock, and water will flow out. We read instead that Moses gathered the people and began speaking to them. "Listen, you rebels." Notice that's Moses' words, never God's. Moses goes on, "Must we provide water from this rock for you?" Well, who exactly is that we? Is it Moses and Aaron? Is it Moses and God? Again, not words that God had given him. I think you see exactly what Bonhoeffer warned about. A leader frustrated, frustrated by the way his own vision is constantly more difficult than he wished, and finding himself in those failures once again turning to judge his brethren, you rebels, judging God, abandoning and moving past God, must we provide this water from this rock for you? And in the end, losing the very thing that he most desired, the promised land. If you know Moses' story, he dies there on Mount Nebo. If you've been there, you can literally ascend to the top and look out at the promised land. You can see the Jordan River Valley. You can see across into the promised land. He made it right there to the edge and looked at it and saw it and ultimately laid it down and died without achieving it. Now, I said that for each of these instincts that we're looking at each week, there's an internal view. Is it possible that this instinct is at work within me and I've been blind to it? Hopefully you're asking some of those questions. Is it possible that there is within you a kind of vision or ambition that is leading you into this perplexing experience of one moment energized action and the next disillusionment and discouraged? Is it possible that your frustrations with others and God and yourself are because you've outpaced him and you're judging everything against your vision instead of his? But I also said the second half of that, after we begin to recognize the instinct in ourselves, the second half is, well, how do I gain some perspective on this? How do I keep perspective on this? Is there a kind of intentional practice I have through faith that allows me to no longer live in the blind spot of this instinct, but to put it in its proper place? I want to suggest to you that the right check on ambition is a practice of Sabbath. In the end, what God asks of Moses is he asks him to set down his ambition. To Moses' credit, he does. He doesn't complain. He doesn't fight it. In fact, he delivers the message of Deuteronomy, reminding the people of how God is faithful and how they should be faithful to him. And he ascends to Mount Nebo and dies there looking at it. Now, the problem with Sabbath is, the way most of us think about Sabbath is a kind of life hack. I hear this all the time, right? If you take one day off, this is God by his clever design, if you take one day off to rest, you'll get even more done with the other 6 than you could have with the 7 and not taking a break, right? As if it's a kind of divine wisdom to help you get more of your ambition, more of your goals accomplished. Get the rest so you can get even more done. It sounds very American, doesn't it, right? A life hack so you can achieve more. That's what Sabbath is. And you'll hear it taught this way all the time. You need it or you'll crash and burn. You need it so that you can keep your energy up. I don't think that's what Sabbath is intended to be. It may have that byproduct. But the real aim of Sabbath is to check your ambition, an intentional practice of stopping what you're doing, stopping what you're striving after, stopping the work that you're consumed with, and allowing yourself to do nothing for a moment, but be. The Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy put it this way, what's I think one of my favorite quotes from the book. If then I were asked for the most important advice I could give, that which I consider to be the most useful to the men of our century, I should say simply, in the name of God, stop a moment, cease your work, and look around you. I think that's as good a definition of Sabbath as I've ever found. I might put it this way to you. Sabbath is intentionally accepting the fact that you will only ever achieve 6/7 of what you're capable of achieving in this life. That's a demoralizing way of putting it, I understand. But I really think that's what Sabbath is intended to do. If I could work every minute of every day after that thing that I most desired to do, I could get to 7 out of 7. But God, by his wisdom that seems to me so strange and foreign at times, has asked me to not do that, but to only work 6 out of 7. And so by it, only to achieve 6/7 of the work that I'm capable of in this life. Let me give you another image of it. Many of you are familiar with the story of Eric Liddell, the Olympic runner from the 1920s, the famous Chariots of Fire movie, if you've seen it as well. Of course, what is most well known about him is his speed, how fast he was, miraculously fast. He felt like he had 2 callings in life. One of those was, you'll remember the line from the movie, when I run, I feel the pleasure of the Lord, right? He felt like he was doing something divinely inspired. But if you know his story, he also felt a call to missions. He felt a call to go to China and serve. And it was really a tension in his life, particularly because he was so good at running. When the Olympics were coming up in the 1920s in Paris, he was scheduled to run, and he was considered to be by a large margin the favorite for the gold in those Paris Olympics. Now, the problem was he had one practice that he never deviated from, which was he did not run or compete on the Sabbath, no matter what, no exceptions. So when the schedule came out for the Paris Olympics and the opening rounds of his favored race came out, and he was scheduled for his first run, his first race to be on a Sunday, he decided to decline participation in that race. And so by it, everyone understood, forfeit the opportunity to win that gold medal. If you've seen the movie, he has a runner that he competes with. There's kind of a friendship, but also an adversarial relationship, Abrams. And he describes his own running this way in the movie. I raised my eyes and looked down that corridor 4 feet wide with only 10 seconds to justify my whole existence. That's ambition. This is the task before me, and I see it with a kind of focus and a kind of clarity. This is the kind of thing we admire in our athletes, right? This kind of focus. Everything in life, every moment of my being, every decision, every dietary decision I make, the food I put in my body, everything is about that simple task before me, that vision, that chance, my whole existence justified in a victory. But then you have Eric Liddell, who decides, well, I don't run on the Sabbath, therefore I guess I won't win a gold. He ended up going on to compete in another race, one that he was not familiar with. He ended up setting a world record in that race. People said it was inspired, was the way that they described it. And it sounds like, if you want to, it sounds like God honored his faithfulness by giving him a gold in another medal. I want to push that story a little deeper for you. There's a later biography of Liddell because after his racing days, he went on to serve in China and was actually captured during the war there and held in an internment camp, a Japanese prison camp, while he was in China. And there's a little-known story in his biography about a group of imprisoned kids who came to him one day and asked if he would referee a game that they were playing. He declined because it happened to be on a Sunday. He had a strict rule, I don't do any sports, anything on a Sunday, so he declined. Well, they came back to him afterwards, and apparently a fight had broken out amongst the kids, several of them sporting black eyes from it. And they asked him the next Sunday, is there any way that you can come referee and officiate these games so that it doesn't descend into chaos again? He ended up deciding to do it. He broke his practice of Sabbath. So his biographer writes this about that moment. He would not run on a Sunday for an Olympic gold medal in the 100 meters and all the glory in the world, but he refereed a game on Sunday. He broke his unbreakable principles just to keep a handful of imprisoned youngsters at peace with each other. It's easy to look at Liddell's Sabbath practice as a kind of legalism. He's a little too strict, right? I'm sure his coaches, his fans had to be saying to themselves, you got to be kidding me. It's one Sunday out of 4 years until this race comes back again. Surely God could cut you a break for one Sunday. But the more you read about his life, the more you begin to realize that it wasn't a kind of legalism, a pharisaicalism. It wasn't as if he believed that somehow God would curse his running if he ran on a Sunday, or that somehow he would have more divine favor if he held to his convictions. It wasn't about proving some saintly level of commitment. His Sabbath was an intentional limitation that he put on himself. Liddell used his Sabbath to keep his running in its proper vocational place. He used it as a check on ambition, the kind of ambition that most of us, the potential of a gold medal and to be the best in the world, would pretty easily get swallowed up by. He was more than a runner. His life was defined by more than a single race, and he knew it, but he also knew the temptation to be defined by it. He knew he needed the Sabbath to restrain his own ambition, and so by it free himself to be more than just that single vision of his life's meaning and success and value. It wasn't a small, cramped, and confided world that he lived in, this world of legalism where he lost gold medals for his values. Instead, it was a world that freed him, one that allowed him to be something more than just a runner, more than just a gold medalist. I think we all need that kind of test of ambition, a willingness to set down the things in our life that we're striving hardest after. It's a good question to ask yourself. Do you know what those things are? Those desperations within your soul, those hungers and appetites that drive you to action. And are you able to set them down? Are you able to turn them off? Are you able, like Moses, after all of those years of striving after it, to recognize the way in which it has led you to disobedience and dishonoring of God, and to set it aside for something better that he gives? Let me wrap up with this, and then we can do some Q&A. I was listening one time to a professor who was lecturing on the moment of Jesus' transfiguration, the moment that he goes up to the mountaintop. The light shines, his clothes become radiant with light, and all of a sudden, do you remember who it is that's joined him there on that mountain? Elijah and Moses. And the professor was explaining his theory that this mountain in which Jesus was transfigured, him being there with his disciples, was probably near the Sea of Galilee. He wasn't speaking about Moses at all, but it struck me in that moment that Moses was with Christ in the promised land. That Moses, in the end, according to the Gospels, was not held in some sort of prison on Mount Nebo, but there he was with Christ in the promised land, that great vision and hope and goal of so much of his life. It struck me that nothing that we set down, nothing that we check, no work that we decide in God's honor to abandon is ultimately lost. That God, by his grace, is able to do more with those 6/7 than we could do with all 7. Last week when we looked at the life of Samson, you might remember my favorite line from that story is, "But the hair grew back on his head." When Samson had lost everything, by God's grace, identity, hair, began to form itself again, his calling, his story. And so too for Moses, who dies on Mount Nebo and does not fulfill that great work of all of those decades, finds himself not in his earthly body, but in that presence with Christ there in the promised land in the end. I think it's a pretty powerful reminder to us that the best way to live is not our own vision, not our own ambition, not our own action, but to check it, to force ourselves to see things God might be doing, to make sure that we don't allow our vision to become the way in which we judge others and judge God and judge ourselves, but instead force ourselves to recognize what God might be doing, and so by it receive something better than by our own work we possibly could. The goal, see it at work in yourself, find a way of intentionally checking it within yourself. Ambition, begin to recognize it in all of its extremes, sometimes driving you to action, sometimes leading you to despair, and begin to recognize through an intentional practice of Sabbath, stopping, you can actually free yourself from the power of it. I want to take some questions. We can do some discussion in Q&A. We could also do it in groups as well, too. But if you've got questions about ambition, maybe a good thing, too. Do you mind me praying? I sort of have a sense, too, that maybe a good way of us responding initially to this is just, God, help us, free us from it as well, too. And then we can do some questions after that. So let's pray. Well, Heavenly Father, I think most of us here tonight recognize how easy it is to get caught up in our visions for ourselves. God, I know how easy it is as a pastor. I know how easy it is as a writer. Good things, things in which you have called me and inspired me, that I take hold of and I begin to run with and outpace you in the process. And God, I see the way in which these visions can lead me to grow frustrated with other people and with you and with myself, the way in which I can begin to judge and measure everything in life against that vision I have and mistake it for something that you've called me to. So I pray tonight by the power of your Spirit, you would just give us a sense of discernment into our hearts, that God, even good things you've called us to, we would recognize them as things that ultimately you're responsible for, that we would find their fulfillment by finding and trusting you. Where you ask us to act and move with boldness, we would do it, but not in a way desperate, not in a way that tries to justify ourselves or outpaces you, but in a way that keeps our attention on you at all times, that we move with our eyes still fixed on you. And so I pray you would teach us just a practice of Sabbath. Most of us are probably doing it to some form on Sundays, but that God, it would be more than just a life hack or a day off. It would be a way of testing our own hearts, of returning again each week to ask in your presence, are we overworking? Are we striving too hard? Are we too desperate to do things ourselves? That you would free us from it, that it wouldn't be like it was for Israel, a kind of slavery, but instead Sabbath, a freedom from it. And for us too, to live into a bigger world in which you are at work and we can recognize it, and we can receive things from you which by our own hands we couldn't achieve. So we repent this evening, and we ask by the power of your Spirit you would just open our eyes and show us and teach us what it is at work within us, and by Sabbath rest, the better work that you can do. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Well, questions? I'm happy to take some questions this evening, too. We can talk. We had a great discussion last time, too, so hopefully there's some questions we can talk through. Yeah, right over here. And they can be anything. For last week, this week. Will answer questions. He knows a lot about stuff I don't, so we can get him up here, too.
Well, I learned that no question is a dumb question, so I'm going to ask a question, or ask a question, but also make a statement. When I listen to you speak about this, I think about humility. When you're defining ambition and talking about these people, I see humility. They put aside their own ambition because they were, to me, following God's call in their life. And when I think about the Word of God teaching us that God does not share His glory, and that when we go to heaven, we're not going to be boasting. I see that whatever we do on earth, He gives us the ability to do it. He even opens the doors to do it. He opens the pathways for us to receive everything that we receive, I believe. I mean, we don't go hungry, I think, because He takes care of us, I just believe that humility is where ambition has to be set at, because you're doing it all for the glory of God. We live for the glory of God. We live to point people to Jesus, So, I could be wrong, but that to me is what it's sounding like when you're speaking about ambition.
Yeah, so I actually write quite a bit about humility in the first instinct, which happens to be the one we skipped, right? We're doing 4 of the 5, which is sarcasm. I actually write about humility and meekness as the counterbalance, the intentional practice to that immaturity of sarcasm, sort of can't take anything seriously. And the way I like to define, which Pastor Jim has a great definition, I think his definition of humility is something like an accurate view of yourself. I think that's the gist of it, right? So you're not too hard on yourself, but you're also not too high on yourself, right? You have a wise and controlled view of yourself. I use the definition for humility, self-suspicion, that a person who's humble has enough self-suspicion to say to themselves, perhaps what I think first might not actually be right. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. My first instinct, my first impulse to act, my first opinion might not be the right one. I write about, I think that's the thing Cain struggled to do. He found the divine lesson God was giving him and immediately felt judged and injustice out of it. He couldn't entertain the idea that God might actually be teaching him something, which is humility. So I certainly think all of these have a kind of building block effect. I think if we have any chance of dealing with ambition, certainly it's going to take humility. I think Moses shows humility in this moment, because when God does correct him for that disobedience, he seems to get it. There's a willingness to get it, partly because I think it's such a severe consequence. But I think the reason I like Sabbath as an intentional practice here too is humility. I actually write about meekness as a practice, because humility has always struck me as one of those virtues that we don't know quite how to do it. We know how to do the opposite. So like, I know how to not boast and not brag, right? So then you just like get humility, I guess, thrown in with that. So I write about meekness as an intentional action. You can read about that in that chapter. But with Sabbath particularly, I think we need something that's pretty consistent practice. Because the thing that I think happens to Moses, and to be honest with you, the thing I see, I've been pastoring 10 years. Some of you have done that much, much longer. There's a kind of familiarity that creeps in with the things of God. There's a kind of, even my own calling and what God's asked me to do, there's a kind of comfort or a kind of proximity to it that I think sometimes can allow me to stop asking what God's doing and assume I just know. Of course I know. God's doing what I'm doing, right? He's called me to do this. And the intentional practice of Sabbath is something that I think by God's design, every single week, we're supposed to stop working and say to ourselves, what are you doing, God? Which breaks some of the power of that familiarity. It forces me to stop making assumptions and for at least one day a week, to ask myself, can I actually do it? Can I actually stop working? Or am I so desperate and so obsessed I can't? And I've been there. I think most of us have, where, okay, I'm taking a Sabbath today, and then I'm sitting and thinking about all the work I need to do tomorrow morning as soon as it starts, and making a list of what I'm going to do first and how I'm going to do it. It's hard to turn it off sometimes. So I like Sabbath as an intentional practice, but yeah, absolutely. I think humility is a big part of it. Yeah.
One of the concerns I have, and I think it relates to what Lewis just asked, is we've seen maybe in some leaders in the church would maybe have successful ministries, accomplish a lot, but then we discover that maybe in their life there's been this secret sins. There have been personality flaws that have not been dealt with. And I'm concerned too in this area of ambition on an individual basis too, that I think it's very important that, we can have this great ambition for out there, but if we're not really checking our heart and seeing what God is trying to speak to us about, I see that quote, great ambition could actually be a very destructive thing if we're not willing to deal with those things.
Yeah, and so next week the instinct we're going to look at is the instinct of reputation, which is the story of David. And I think we're going to get to see quite a bit of that at work, the way that success can lead us to a kind of divided life, a question of what does real integrity look like. So I think we'll get into quite a bit of that. The challenge of ambition is that, again, as I said at the beginning, it can be a really good thing. I mean, I do believe God called me to ministry. But I also know there can be a tendency in me to pick that up and start sprinting with it and get ahead of God and imagine I know exactly what he's asking me to do when it's not. And certainly I think that happens and leads to failure. But yeah, I think we'll cover a lot more of that next week too. So, yeah.
Chase, do you think that one being over ambitious can sort of affect how you feel on the calling that the Lord has for you? In other words, you think there's a hindrance by you being so overconfident or thinking that, I'm just going to do my own thing, even though the Lord might have a different plan for your life?
I think what's so hard about this one is there are no temptations, in my opinion, that are harder than good things that become ultimate things. Good things that become, I think that's, in some degree, the original temptation. He didn't say, deny God, right? He said, you could be like God. Did God really say, right? It's this sort of twisting of a good thing. Like, the garden is good, and of course God's creation is good. Then why can't you have this, right? It's a good thing that sort of gets distorted. That line Bonhoeffer has about God hates visionary dreaming, I think about all the time. Because I know in myself how easy it is for God to ask me to do something, which if I'm honest about what he's asked me to do, oftentimes what God has asked me to do is probably simpler and smaller than what I imagine. I start filling in and connecting all the dots pretty quick. I start jumping to conclusions about what it's going to look like and how the outcomes are going to come. I start daydreaming, right? I start putting together a vision. I imagine what it's going to play out to be. And there's a certain degree of that if it's held open-handed before the Lord, I think is okay. I don't think God gets mad at us for imagining great things that he could do. But if we start to cling to that, if it starts to become our identity, if we start to judge success in our life and other people by it, then I think we can move ourselves into places and start acting in ways. I think we can start disobeying God as Moses does. And I think we can put ourselves in positions God might not be asking of us or calling us to. God's grace is huge. He rescues Samson. He puts Moses back in the promised land. I think God's always able to figure that stuff out and sort it out for us, even when we've outpaced him, because God knows we do it all the time. But yeah, I think I try to ask myself a lot, okay, how do I take my attention off what I'm imagining, what I want to see, what my vision is? And how do I just get more of my attention back on, God, what are you doing? And what are you actually asking of me? This is the other thing. I try to ask myself, what is the work that I imagine is the work, and what is the work God is actually asking of me? Because oftentimes God may be asking something of me sometimes it may be greater. We'll get to that with apathy. But oftentimes God's not asking as much of me as I sometimes am. I'm sort of overloading this thing he's called me to with all of my insecurities and vulnerabilities and expectations. When God's asking for a kind of faithfulness and a kind of humility that vision can actually make hard to see. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
One of the things that I fell into as a trap personally was, I had a really ambitious father, And then I grew up with brothers, very competitive. And by the time we all got into college, I had two brothers that went to UCLA. One was very ambitious, got a football scholarship. My twin brother got into UCLA. I went on to college. And I found the trap was I blurred the lines between ambition and commitment. That I make a great sacrifice and I'm making this great commitment. And all of a sudden, by blurring the lines of all of a sudden, there's this wake of, consequences on others that I ignored as a sacrifice. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think in my case, and this was all pre-Christ in my life, so it's now beginning to see that blurring the lines, seeing how it affected not only my brothers and my father, but myself. So this is an interesting.
Yeah, well, and that's what I really mean Sabbath probably more practical than you think. Like, it's easy for this to sound abstract or theoretical. I mean, like, actually, one day a week, can you stop working? Like, can you stop thinking about it? Can you stop obsessing over it? Can you stop measuring things by it? This is a work in progress. I mean, there's Sundays that doesn't go well for me. There's times that I do better at it. But that, more than it is, and that's what I've tried to make the point with the Liddell story, it's more than that being, am I obeying, am I keeping the rules? It's a tool that's used for discernment and for testing. That, there are things I'm desperate for in my life and holding on to that are making Sabbath impossible for me. That should be a kind of red flag that something has become more important to me, that ambition has gotten out of place and needs to be intentionally checked. So yeah, hopefully the way I'm talking about Sabbath is not philosophical, but I really mean it. It should be a tool, a regular tool in your life to check how desperate am I, how much is this vision controlling my life. Yeah.
Quick comment on Sabbath. One of the things that I do, and this is just me, is focus on creation, on my Sabbath. What God has created and how I can enjoy it and how I can enjoy God because of it. And is this Will up here?
Yeah, that's my son.
I was going to ask Will a question. No, I'm just kidding, Will.
He'd probably have
But
the
his
answer,
heart rate went up. Now, here's my question that deals with our subject. And I'm trying to figure out how to pose this, because if I'm working with someone, let's say, I'm going to put him on the spot. Let's say I'm working with Mike here, and Mike comes across as a visionary. Mm-hmm. Everything he does is because God gave him a vision of what it's supposed to look like. And I'm supposed to work with him in his vision. Although there are times when his vision fails, there are times when his vision is successful. But I'm number two in the line of chain of command here, and I got to work with him. I can understand the instincts so far as me as a person, and I can control. I can have better control of it. But when the guy I'm working for doesn't get it, and everything, he plays the God card. God told me this. God told me that. This is the way it's going to go because God said it. How help me, can I, no, Mike is not this way, I don't believe, but I have dealt with that for several years, and I'm not sure how to interact with that person because I'm not buying his vision. And I just stepped aside. That's the only way I could control it.
Yeah, I wish there was an easy answer for that. I mean, I think there's not. I think we're first accountable for what we do with our own ambition. We try to recognize that and check it in ourselves. I think what you're describing is realistic. I think Moses does it. When Moses says, listen, you rebels, must we provide water from this rock for you? And again, who's the we, right? Like, he's sort of combining himself with God, in my opinion, in that moment, or at least saying, I'm the one who gives water. So he's mistaking himself for God or putting himself in God's place. And we've certainly all been around people or perhaps abuses of leadership where that person's vision has become so controlling for them that they treat others exactly the way that I'm trying to describe. They judge people, they measure people against it, they get frustrated. My heart in the book is to make sure that that's not happening in me first. I don't know if I have a whole lot of advice on how to solve that in someone else. But I think to be able to recognize it for what it is, and to recognize, I think with some humility, that this is a really hard trap for so many of us, and it's one of those traps that the less aware of it you are, you tend to be driven by it harder too, because the less that vision is being fulfilled, the more need you feel to push harder and harder, and the harder you push, the less aware of it you are. And it does have a tendency, I think, to snowball on you to a point where everything in your whole view becomes consumed with this vision that you carry on your shoulders that is ultimately you and no longer God. So I think, the only thing I could say is learning to be aware of it in ourselves first and asking for God's help, discernment for those around us that we may see struggling with it. Any other questions? All right, well, I think we've got 10 minutes or so. I'm happy to give you another discussion question if you want tonight too, and so we can do that. Last week that was helpful, and Anthony can give us directions how we want to do that, or if it's just something to take home with you as well too, maybe to discuss with the spouse. But I'd be really interested to have a discussion, or for you to be able to discuss how is it that Sabbath can be a check on ambitions? How does it actually end up doing that? I know I've been saying that's something that shouldn't be abstract, but should be actual and real. So, his brother was saying creation is a tool that I use. What are some of the ways that you can implement Sabbath, not just for a day of relaxation to recharge, but how do you use Sabbath as an intentional tool to check your own ambitions?
That's great. If we give Chase a round of applause tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chase, again. So why don't we do that for a few minutes, if you'd like, to just kind of turn around and talk to some of the immediate people around you, and answer that question. What are some ways you can use Sabbath as a tool for to check that ambition that you may have in your life? And then you're dismissed whenever you'd like to leave. We do have Chase's book again back in the lobby area over there. They are $15 for that, and Chase will be back there. He can take your money for that. So thank you, guys.